It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson, and as always, I have my co-host, Andy Grabner, today. Andy, how are you doing?
I'm really good. You're so polite all of a sudden. You made some terrible jokes earlier about me, and what's wrong? What's happened? Why are you polite all of a sudden?
It's repentance. I feel bad.
Okay.
You know? Plus, the people on the other side of the speaker, they only have to know about our beautiful relationship. They don't have to know about the dark side and all
not the dirty secrets.
Yes. That'll come out in 10 years from now when we're both on Skid Row with bad drug habits. It'll be like how it fell apart. Anyway, speaking of things falling apart, I'm going to try an Andy segue. Mm-hmm. Speaking of things falling apart, right? Deployments fall apart all the time. New technologies fall apart all the time. A lot of times people go ahead and try to use the fancy new toy, and there's no good guidelines on how to get started. No good ways to say, hey, what could we have done if we only knew or had some experience to build on? Or does this sound? Am I going in the right direction, Andy?
I think you're completely.
Save me?
Yeah, I'm not going to save you. I'm just continuing your thoughts. The latest new cool technology, as we all know, is Kubernetes. We had several people on the show lately talking about Kubernetes and what it all allows us, kind of getting us to the promised land of enabling every developer to deploy into production at any point without any problems, because it's endless scalable, it performs well, and you don't have to think about anything else other than writing a couple of lines of YAML code.
just YAML, yeah.
Just YAML, yeah, that's the only thing.
Number one.
The thing is now, so for real, we're all moving to that direction, right? Most of the listeners are probably already in Kubernetes. Some will have to learn it. And there are happy moments and sad moments. And we want to make sure that the happy moments, that you will have more happy moments than sad moments with Kubernetes. And this is why we brought Christian Heckelmann on the podcast today. Christian from ERT, who has been, I think, Christian, first of all, hi. I want to give you the word. Hi.
Hello.
Hey, Christian, we've been talking, we've been working together for, a year or two or even more. I don't remember. I think it was Barcelona.
So it's with all the COVID around, you cannot tell what year it is right now, right?
Exactly. And you've been a part of the journey with, obviously Dynatrace and with Captain. But what really today is not about Captain, it's not about Dynatrace. It's really about your experience and your work that you're doing in adopting Kubernetes for the company you work for, and the things you've learned, the things you love, the things you don't like so much, things you would have wished you would have known before you get started. And you did a great presentation, which we're probably going to share. You titled it "How Not to Start with Kubernetes." A lot of great wisdom, a lot of great memes in there. And
it's more kind of a comic book.
It's which makes it more enjoyable to learn and work with Kubernetes, right? Yep. But in all seriousness, before we get started, Christian, can you give us a little background to yourself, because people can then better relate on who are you, where did you come from, especially professionally, so that they know how why you're actually transitioning over to Kubernetes and what you're doing right now with Kubernetes.
First of all, my current position is a DevOps engineer at ERT. So a couple of years ago, I didn't have anything to do with Kubernetes or Docker at all. So I was a database administrator. And before I was a database administrator for around about 6, 7, 8 years, I don't recall at the moment, I was in charge of the network of my former company. And before then, I was kind of a field engineer outside. And so when I started, so that my second time I'm working for ERT. And when I started at ERT, we didn't have any Kubernetes, any Docker environments or something like that. We were deploying our services via Puppet or on IaaS with web deploy, etc. And I think it was 3 years ago or something like that. It was Kubernetes 1.9 back in the days. We started to, having a POC because one of our architects were asking us, so, hey, do you want to start building something Kubernetes because we want to utilize this as a microservice platform and so on. But there were also competitors there on the market like Docker Swarm at this time and Mesos, for instance, and we did that comparison. And that was the first mistake we did, that we did this kind of submarine project, I will call it in German. I don't know if there isn't the same in English, because I'm not a native speaker. And we started that, my task was then to install a Kubernetes cluster, which they can play around, our developers. And another guy was taking the Docker Swarm part. And there the whole journey started, I would say, with Kubernetes in our company. And as I said, that was a first mistake, not to bring everybody on board building the platform, because building a Kubernetes cluster or installing Kubernetes cluster is not the problem, but maintaining it, thinking about all the other stuff like networking, storage, and so on and so on and so on. This is quite a hard learning curve, at least from my perspective. So I started going to Kubernetes.io or what the domain is, and reading through the docs and how to install Kubernetes. And I've provisioned myself 3 Linux VMs and started with kubeadm and all the stuff, right? Basically building Kubernetes from scratch. And it was kind of, okay, it's working. And then we thought about, okay, how are we getting our traffic inside the cluster? And it was kind of, okay, Googling and then searching by myself. So if you're starting, I would always recommend, if you start using Kubernetes, get help. If you don't have the knowledge in your company, get external knowledge consultants or whatever, and start working with them, because a lot of mistakes I made in the past were just because I didn't know it better, or you couldn't find in the internet any better solutions. So that's quite a big challenge running Kubernetes, especially if you're running it on-prem, right? Yeah. So running Kubernetes on-prem is pain in the...
I just wanted to ask a question about that, because it's an interesting topic. Andy, as we often discuss with guests, a lot of times they're experimenting on your own, just like you were, Christian, and it's hard to get buy-in until you can prove something out. So what you just proposed there about getting external help, if it's paid, is sort of one of those chicken and the egg problems, because how are you going to get budget to get external help if you haven't proven something out, maybe haven't even gotten buy-in yet from your management? Obviously, we've always seen success cases on migrations have been with upper management buy-in. But if you're doing this from the ground up in the submarine project, how would you recommend somebody goes about? Are there free external resources that you're aware of? I know you mentioned something about the internet. At this point now, as opposed to when you started, are there some resources people can leverage that they wouldn't necessarily have to go to a paid level yet that they can start at? Or how would someone tackle that from your point of view, Christian?
So when you're using or when you want to deploy Kubernetes, there are great provisioners. So tools you can use to start with, and which will give you the ability to spin up a Kubernetes cluster, a quite stable one, without the deep knowledge. Like I stumbled across Rancher, which is an open source project, but even though they're buying or you can buy from them professional support as well. But if you want to provision some clusters, they have a quite good documentation on how to do stuff, configuring ingress and load balancing on your cluster, and so on and so on and so on. So I would recommend to do something like that, or using other tools like Hops, VMware Tanzu, or whatever, what your company is able to do. And Yeah, but it's still like when you're searching in the internet, you find for one Kubernetes setup or what you want to achieve, tons of different documentations and guides and when you're taking a look at the CNCF landscape, what I'm always doing if I need to bring in something new, like new storage provisioner or whatever, I'm looking at the CNCF landscape and looking there what tools are available, which are not officially supported, but which are projects within the whole Kubernetes ecosystem, right? Not relying on some weird GitHub repos with some scripts in it. That's basically what I can tell the people. And even though if you're starting with your Kubernetes, you have to think about what kind of workload you want to run on your cluster. Mm-hmm. Right, it's not only here building a cluster and then shifting everything from your big monolith into a container and then throw it into the cluster. I think this will make you not happy to operate the cluster, right? Because you will find a lot of side effects here and there.
One of the resources that I found recently it's called TechWorld with Nana. She is an amazing YouTuber on technology topics. She's actually in Austria. She's from Vienna. And I reached out to her, and Brian, we may have her on one of the upcoming podcasts, hopefully once she has time. But she did an amazing set of tutorials, and she has like several 100,000 views on these tutorials. So a lot of them are free. Most of them are obviously free on YouTube, giving you like a 4 hours or an 8 hours course on Kubernetes, getting started with it. So I suggest folks will add the link to this as well. But to kind of, Christian, what I hear from you is, and this is also part of your presentation, right? Don't start with installing Kubernetes from scratch. When by now time has passed, there's many options to really, get started with Kubernetes. And maybe even you just go to your favorite cloud provider and then you just spin up a managed instance there. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, but even though if you're starting on a Kubernetes cluster, if it's a GCP or an EKS cluster or what it's called in Alibaba Cloud, I don't know. I would say if you only have to support one kind of application, or your company is really small and you don't have a lot of dependencies across your environment, like services needs to talk with services on your on-prem environment and a lot of routing and so on, then spinning up an EKS cluster it's really easy, right? But as soon as you have to connect all the services with your legacy applications and so on, then you still need to figure out, okay, how I'm sizing my VPCs, how I'm doing routing there, how I'm doing security, and then all of the stuff you need to think about. While, of course, something like load balancing. So one of the things I learned was running Kubernetes on-prem. If you want to run a load balancer, you first need to have something like MetalLB in place. So you can have a floating IP around your cluster and then setting on top an ingress controller to distribute the traffic inside of your cluster. And if you're running this in let's say managed system, then you have to think about the costs as well, right? Mm-hmm. Sure, you can install an AWS, the AWS LB controller, and every time you're deploying the service, it will spin up a complete entire load balancer for you, which is great. But if you're having a couple of hundreds of services running on your cluster, then it will be getting quite expensive. Yeah. Right, having 400 load balancers here in place, and then you should think about, okay, I need an ingress controller for them, because not all services needs to have their own load balancer, right? And so on. So there are still considerations you need to make when you're running on a cloud, but it gets getting much easier, because a lot of issues I had was just because of the fact we didn't know how to configure or having best practices in place for your worker nodes. Let's say some system settings on in our case, CentOS machines, right? Which was So little story here. I had the issue that with CentOS and XFS file system, the slab unreclaimable cache was filling up, and worker nodes were crashing out of sudden. And this was all because of a lot of mounts which were made from one of our deployments. And we didn't know why. So it's and you have to dig into the kernel crash files and reading a lot of kernel bugs and so on to find out, okay, when I change the file system to ext4, we don't have this issue anymore. And this is what you don't have to think about when you're running on an EKS cluster or a managed cluster, right? But you still have to think about other stuff you need to consider, like load balancing I mentioned before, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, you bring up a lot of points that I didn't run through into each of those because I'm not as deep down into the weeds and having to provision and manage these Kubernetes clusters for a whole organization, but just for the work we've been doing with Captain, where we have been, providing different ways to stand up Kubernetes clusters, whether we give people instructions on how to use EKS and AKS or something like that, that's kind of easy. But then people are not familiar with Kubernetes and maybe they want to run it on a K3S, as you know, right? We've been using keys or micro Kubernetes. But all of a sudden, I think this was my wrong perception was I thought I run a comment and I have a Kubernetes cluster and all of a sudden I can just deploy my apps and I don't have to take care of anything else because Kubernetes takes care of everything. But then I realized that I have to understand what is an ingress. What can I configure on an ingress? The topmost question I get now on the Captain Slack channel is how can I make sure that my ingress is exposing my services to the outside world with SSL, with TLS. And these are all things that I, coming from my background as a developer, never thought of. I never had to think about networking. I never had to think about security. And all of a sudden, if you really want to use this platform as a quote-unquote self-service magic tool, you have to take care of this, right? And this is where I think some of the misconception always comes in. It is challenging.
Yeah, it is challenging. And when you mentioned the developers, so developers should focus on writing code and not think about how networking is being done and so on and so on. But you need to understand the basic concepts of Kubernetes, how, for instance, you're calling another service within your cluster, right? So what I always see is developers are provisioning or you're installing a service, deploy a service in the Kubernetes cluster, defining an ingress, and then calling another service through the ingress. So the traffic is flowing outside of the Kubernetes cluster to the public internet, back to the Kubernetes cluster, which are basically, it's latency, right, for your service.
Well, latency and costs.
And costs, yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
And I also had no clue about, right, again, when I started, and now a year and a half into it, I think I completely agree with you. Next time when I would start with something like this, I take the time and sit down and go through documentation, some training, because you can avoid a lot of basic mistakes like exactly this, and you are not aware of these mistakes. Or like that, you talked about the load balancers. If I spin up an EKS and I just say load balancer ingress, that's awesome, and everything works fine, and then you get the bill at the end of the month.
Yeah. Exactly. And also other mistakes. So there's one slide in my presentation where I'm is this Oprah meme with everybody gets admin, right? Mm-hmm. This was in the beginning. I hadn't had a clue about RBAC and all the security stuff in Kubernetes. That was something I learned afterwards, after developers deleted entire namespaces and environment-based namespaces, not application namespaces, even environment namespaces, and how to prevent stuff like that, or how to, let's say, if you forget in your ingress annotation, in our case, the host field, it will create an asterisk, a wildcard ingress for you. So out of sudden, every traffic was routed to the one deployment, and every other was yelling, "What's happening? When I'm calling my URL, I'm getting the other service, right?" And so this was, I could mitigate this using the Open Policy Agent, for instance. but also RBAC you need to think about, and don't give everybody admin access on the server, right? So
yeah, because you would also not give everybody full access to all your production servers all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think this is the challenging, again, this is kind of the balance. We all preach, at least, in the work I do, we preach about autonomy. We preach about how can we give everybody more responsibility, but still giving them enough guardrails so that they cannot make mistakes. And I think this is the challenging thing now with Kubernetes also to find out. It's a great platform if you use it right, but also it's such a huge platform that not everybody should have access to everything, but you have to have a basic knowledge, and you have to figure out what makes sense to give into the hands of certain people and what doesn't make sense. Where do you need to provide some processes using tools like continuous delivery tools that can then automate certain things, right?
Yeah. And, a big part is documentation. To have documentation for the developers in place, to have templates in place they can reuse. Like I created a Helm template, for instance, which was basically covering most of our deployments, and doing stuff like preventing stuff like accidentally exposing the service to the internet when it's not needs to be exposed to the internet, right? Or setting resource limits by default on the deployment. Because what I've seen, or this was also a big learning thing for me, that dealing with resource limits and requests in Kubernetes. So on our first cluster, I was always wondering, okay, why is node is exploding? Why it's not working anymore? What is happening there? And then I figured out, okay, so the pods are utilizing too much space or whatever, too much memory. Java applications are quite memory consumption very high, right? So what I did is, first of all, setting resource limits on namespaces. So they cannot overutilize the RAM or CPUs, and also building this into our template, so this will be not forgotten anymore when they're deploying something, right? And stuff like that. So documentation, trainings for the developers when they want to start using Kubernetes, because building a Docker image is quite easy. Deploying something to Kubernetes is quite easy, but does it always make sense? Is the other question, right?
Yeah, that's actually a good one. So is Kubernetes necessarily by default the right choice for any type of app, or might it be better to think about other platforms in the future? Or like, I don't know, it could be that you're just deploying a container on an ECS or Fargate, or maybe it's serverless is better, or maybe it's just an old-fashioned VM and you just run it somewhere.
Yeah, my the best example I have here is websites, static websites. So why you should deploy a static website as a container or deployment in Kubernetes when you can put it into an S3 bucket and you're good to go, right? That's running container is costing.
Do you run regular training sessions? Like, how does this work? Do you do regular training sessions, or do you wish to have regular training sessions with developers, or how does this work?
Yeah, so from time to time, when I'm seeing there is something popping up like, hey, we want to deploy something to Kubernetes, then I'm reviewing the application or what they are doing there, giving guidance, having training. It depends on the knowledge of the developers. But in the end, it all comes to governance, that when somebody is writing new service, that architect should look into it, should decide, okay, it doesn't make sense to run it on Kubernetes. I'm not using Kubernetes only because you can spin up an environment very fast and without having to tell anybody else, right? Because what I've seen when we started using Kubernetes, that every developer was throwing its application into a container and on the cluster, because they don't need to go over the and I don't know, the hurdle. The hurdle, yeah, whatever. So I'm German, so I apologize. To create a merge request in our Puppet Hira configuration, right? So and they used to Kubernetes to bypass this. even though if the service doesn't make sense at all to run in Kubernetes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm hearing a lot of in this conversation, and thank you both for, I've been being quiet because I've been trying to listen and learn. It sounds as if there's a disconnect between the general marketing of Kubernetes, and I'll use that loosely because there's no Kubernetes company per se, right? But the general marketing of Kubernetes as pop it in, everyone can be self-sufficient, and things just run smooth and easy, right? Which most of us at this point know it's not as simple as that. But Kristen, as you mentioned, things like training, like documentation, and all these things that for decades people have been trying to move away from, we're obviously not moving anywhere. Now, the way I see Kubernetes, and I don't mean to say that Kubernetes is a loss, right? Because Kubernetes is opening a whole new world for great other things. What I think there's just still a lot of overhead and maintenance, scripting and all, but a different type. And the benefit of Kubernetes is that as opposed to, let's say, in the old days where you had to stand up your servers, you had to have a physical location to run it yourself. You couldn't just pay someone else to do it easily. You had to pick your network, set up your network, do all this other kind of stuff. You can now spend time automating a lot of your deployment process, which gives you back that time to do these things like the documentation, the training, and these other bits that are still going to, some of these things are not going to go away. We're still humans. We're still stupid, meaning we don't have these things programmed into us. And if, program Andy crashes, we can't rely on program Andy being there. So this has to be documented. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is that while not all the things that we all hate about traditional setups goes away, the critical functions still remain. Yet, because of the advancements in technologies, this gives us the ability to automate and push past a lot of these other things that we would normally have to do in tandem with the documentation and everything else. So it's not a net loss. It's still a net win. But I think most people have to come to the realization that this is not some magic fairyland where, if we think back to Cloud Foundry, the idea is, here's my code. I forget what the haiku was, Andy. Here's my code. Deploy it. I don't care where.
Yeah, exactly.
That's you still have a whole team of people maintaining that Cloud Foundry thing, but at least for the developer on that side, it's a bit more abstracted. Here, as you're saying, there are a lot of things you still have to know and learn. And I guess just bursting the bubble that it's not just plug and play. Did plug and play ever come to fruition? Remember way back when plug and play came on, or am I dating myself? It's still going to be tough, and there's still a lot of things. And that's why I think this guide that you put together is so awesome, because it's covering a lot of these things. And earlier when I was talking about, are there any resources out there for people? Although this isn't like a definitive resource, this gives you a lot of things to say, hey, what are some check marks we should go through? Mm-hmm. Anyhow, I'll shut up now. I've been rambling.
No, that was good. I think...
So what I already told Andy yesterday, so when you're building a Kubernetes environment or Kubernetes cluster, it's not only the platform the developers are using. You're building that, in the end, you're building a small data center within your data center or within the cloud, right? With all the different dependencies like networking and so on, storage, blah, blah, blah. And you need to think about the stuff when you need people who are taking care of the stuff as well. I mean, I had a little smile on my face when Google announced their autopilot feature of Kubernetes last week or this week. I don't remember, which are taking away a lot of administrative tasks, but also saying, okay, you can now only use this kind of networking provision or CNI plugin or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. But it's basically, in the end, you can only control the complexity if you're reducing the number of potential combinations that make it so complex, right? That's why it's an opinion. It becomes an opinionated platform.
And we're back to Cloud Foundry, as I mentioned once in an episode several months ago.
Yeah, and I think
they had an idea there.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Brian. And I think this is also what we all try to do, right? We try to leverage the new shiny thing, but then we learn while it's great and powerful, it in the end doesn't make us more productive, or at least not the developers. Therefore, we need to come up with a very clear, defined, prescriptive, opinionated path of doing 80 or 90% of the work. And for the rest of the 10 remaining percent, yes, we may then need to go and look into some other options outside of our opinionated way. But I agree with this is also why we invest, so much on standardizing things, whether it's open telemetry, whether it's the stuff, and now I say it with Captain, right? We try to, it's all about making it easier to get work done on top of something that is very complex. But we also have to narrow down the complexity, because this is also why if you look at what we ended up doing with Captain, we are really narrowing it down now to say, if you want to try Captain, then you take a Kubernetes cluster, and we want you to use, let's say, Istio as a service mesh, and we just give you in the first iteration of Captain, we said it is deploy, test, evaluate. This was super easy and super clear. Now we went a further step, because we had people that say, well, we need more flexibility, but still by default, we give this prescriptive approach and say, this is how we think you are most productive in deploying this particular type of technology or app or service. And if you use it for 80% of the use cases, we think you're going to be fine. And for the 20%, you can turn some knobs, and you can change our opinion to be closer to your opinion. And I think, Brian, we had a similar discussion in one of the episodes we recorded that hasn't aired yet as of today, but I think it was with Baruch, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yes, the liquid software.
The liquid software, same thing. Right?
Yeah. Well, by the time people listen to this, it will have aired. It's the previous episode, but yeah.
Christian, I know in the end of your presentation, and we will share it, you have a nice conclusion, and as I think Brian highlighted before we started the recording, there's a nice meme on there. It says the H in Kubernetes stands for happiness. But you have a nice summary of points of things that you want to be careful with, like don't deploy a production cluster without the review of a professional. Right? That makes a lot of sense. And train the people. We already covered that. The templates. I know you covered it slightly, but I have a question on templates. So if you provide templates, but you allow people to modify templates are just templates, but if you don't enforce them, do templates alone help you? Do you need governance or something else on top as well? Because otherwise people can do whatever they want with the templates.
So when you're having a lot of microservices and a lot of developers who are adjusting templates and so on, it's quite hard to get an overview of what they are doing there. So at least that's my what I've seen, what's happening. But it could be in other companies, another thing, right? So a lot of companies who are only deploying one set of software is different than having a lot of different systems flying around, legacy systems, and then want to transition to Kubernetes. But in my opinion, you still need to have some kind of governance who are looking on new services, new deployments, which are then going to Kubernetes cluster. So developers could play on one cluster if they want, right? And nobody wants to restrict them into playing around with stuff. But as soon as a service is getting promoted to a higher stage, to an official integration environment or whatever, then somebody should really look at what they are doing there and how the service is working. Normally, in my opinion, this is classical task for the software architects, right? So they review the service, what the service is doing, what the communication of the service is, and so on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I want to ask you now, you mentioned earlier some of the things that happen and that shouldn't happen, like no resource limits. You mentioned access control, and somebody was accidentally deleting all the namespaces. Any other horror story? Or
A lot.
Wow.
So I think I've found every Fettnäpfchen.
Yeah.
And here again, a German word dropped. I don't have.
Was that Farfignugan?
Fettnäpfchen.
Fettnäpfchen, yeah. If you step, it literally translated, it means you're stepping into a puddle of fat. That means you make a bad step, and then you do
so
something
gross.
that you shouldn't do, right?
What are there puddles of fat? Sorry, are there puddles of fat laying around in Germany that this came from? Like, anyhow,
Well,
I'll look that up. I'll look that up how that came about, because that's just fascinating how that term would come about.
Yeah, a lot of ice was lying around in Bavaria. Sure. So for instance, a classical thing is tagging of your Docker images and using something like tag latest. Right. So I can remember I was searching around to get a storage provisioner. Right. So I used in the beginning of our first or second cluster, cluster-fs combined with a caddy to provision persistent volumes. And it's a classical copy and paste, and it's working. We have persistent volumes, but I didn't realize that the deployment of a caddy was using the tag latest, and node goes up, node goes down, and all of a sudden it was and it was using for at the end the image pull policy always, which means every time the pod getting restarted, it will be pulled in the latest image from your caddy, and all of a sudden our storage provisioning was not working anymore. And it was kind of, okay, what's going on here? And then you have to dig into the problem and, okay, why it's not working anymore, and so on and so on. And even developers were using, for instance, a heavily used image, it's Alpine, and they're using Alpine latest. And I can remember in Barcelona at the Perform, on one day there was an vulnerability found in the Alpine image for empty root password or something like that. And they updated the Alpine image, and I was getting pinged by everyone in our company, or a lot of people kind of, hey, my service isn't working anymore in Kubernetes. Kubernetes down, help, world is on fire. And I was kind of, but your pod isn't working at all, right? It's, what should I do? Kubernetes is working, so your pod isn't starting up. And have you tried to run the pod locally, for instance? That's also something I've seen a lot, that developers are just using the CI/CD tools to build their containers and throw it in the cluster, and really developing inside of the cluster instead of trying, okay, is my Dockerfile building my application? So I have a lot of tickets regarding, hey, my deployment isn't working. Yeah, but your Dockerfile could not be built. So try it locally, fix it locally, or then you can avoid this turnaround times for fixing stuff like that.
And especially because then you become the bottleneck, and you deal with things that you shouldn't deal with, because these are basic things that should be checked beforehand.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, for the latest, latest tag, isn't that something where OPA comes in, the Open Policy Agent, that can be used for that, to validate no latest is used?
Yeah, sure. And I think it should be possible with OPA, or how it's pronounced in English. I don't know. Open Policy Agent.
OPA.
OPA. And OPA is German and means grandfather. Yeah.
Yes, my mom had a friend who's what was the grandmother? Her German. Yeah, Opa. Yep. I knew this from that, but I forgot what it was. I just know I heard it. So I'm just pretending to be cool with you guys.
Yeah, but I have a question of the Christian. Do you also say Oma and Opa, or do you say Großvater and Großmutti?
I'm saying Oma, Opa.
Okay.
But it depends on the region in Germany.
Yeah, same here, I guess. Oma and Opa is very Austrian everywhere, I think, but...
As you know, I'm a little bit Austrian.
Yeah.
It's funny because when I know this total sidetrack, but when I was
Yeah.
But I just have to say this because a lot of times there'll be music that I like, and I always want to go to Andy with it, but I'm like, no, it's German, it's not Austrian. And I'm thinking like, well, is it close enough? And then I'm like, well, is Canadian close enough to United States? I'm like, nah, totally different. They speak the same language, but it's different enough. So I don't. That's why I don't bother you with the German music I listen to.
No problem. So
Andy.
I'm the master of sidetracks normally.
Yeah, but so speaking of this latest, just to clarify, right? Because I'm pretty sure I understand what the deal is, but for people who might not understand what people are doing, what it sounds like people are doing is instead of saying which version they want to get, so because a lot of times when you're getting something from Docker or GitHub or something, you just say latest, and that's a default tag that gets applied to whatever the latest push is, right? That's not something that people necessarily even put on their builds. But the latest will always just get the latest. So the recommendation would always say use the specific version that you want instead of just latest, because obviously if you're always getting latest, so as soon as someone updates it, you're going to get that new one. You have no idea what you're going to get.
And another one, it's a security, I would say, issue as well. If you're pulling some images straight from Docker Hub, you are not aware of what is inside the image. Even popular public images couldn't be compromised. Mm-hmm. And so I always recommend to have a set of base images which developers can reuse in your own registry, which you scanned and released for official use for your developers. That's one of the things I would recommend as instead of running all the stuff. But as Andy asked me for other mistakes I've seen. So despite the fact, and I should call my Twitter handle Grumpy Admin after this show, because I'm only complaining. But Kubernetes is great. Kubernetes is great for automation and so on. But from time to time, you're thinking about, okay, classical example. Somebody is deploying an application and it's kind of, okay, I've deployed 2 pods, and you kind of, okay, and where is your auto-scaling configuration? And I've deployed 2 pods. It's high available, and I'm fine with that. And you're kind of, okay, why you don't use all the stuff Kubernetes is for, right? Automatically scaling your deployment. It's like deploying 2 VMs in a data center and you're good to go. No, that's not how it should work, right? And here we are again back on the training story to something like that, or health checks in the deployment. If you're getting an email from one of the developers like, hey, can you restart my service in Kubernetes? You'll be like, what right?
Because this is core capability and exactly what's built. I understand.
I think it's great that you're complaining, because again, we always hear about the positive side of Kubernetes, which there's a lot, right? Yeah. But this is the real world. Yeah. Like what are the admins dealing with? What are the things that people are still, what's the people factor, the human factor of leveraging this? You can build in whatever guardrails you want. You can't, as they say, you can't fix stupid, right? So you still have that human factor that's going to do things wrong, not leverage what's built in there. You know, it goes back to way back when I had a job at a record store. We had a big suck because there was like this island in the middle of the store where we had like, Walkmans and radios that you could buy, but then the register was at the front, and over the register was a gigantic sign with an arrow that said register, like where to pay, the cash. And people would go stand at the other side of it, like with their CDs in their hand wanting to buy it. And you're like, it's over here under the big sign, right? Like you can't pull that out. Yep. You still have, someone's not doing a health check, right? What do you say? How do you deal with that? That's something you can't program. I mean, fortunately and unfortunately, right? Because if we could be programmed, well, that's a whole different debate we won't get into. But if we can be programmed as easily as computers, then we wouldn't be human, I guess. So.
Yeah, and I have to say, people are people, and from time to time, people are stupid. So and I see it every day at the moment, because in front of my window they are rebuilding a bridge, and they close the streets around it. And you will not expect how many people are driving inside of the construction, even big trucks, and then trying to turn around and so on. But it says, hey, stop here. The road is closed, but people are still driving through, this construction site. And it's the same with developers. It's the same with administrators. It's, everywhere it's the same. And I'm not better So
no, not at all. We all make mistakes. It's good to hear about them, though.
Yeah, and also there was this episode, I cannot recall her name, but CD version 2, right?
Tracy Reagan.
And this is cool. There are a lot of cool concepts, and I got her point when she said, okay, we only need one, or that people are thinking we only need one big Kubernetes environment and throw everything, every development, integration, or production pre-prod environment into one Kubernetes cluster. But as Andreas mentioned in this episode, how do you validate if you want to, upgrade your storage provisioner inside the cluster? If you want to upgrade your ingress controller in the cluster, that it will work. So these are central components of your Kubernetes. Or if you want to upgrade the Kubernetes version at all, I would say I'm more on the side to test it in advance on another system before I'm running it on production. And it's the whole shiny new world. It's blinking around and everybody wants to use it, as you already mentioned. But it's not everything gold, right?
Yeah.
And I think this whole thing with you cannot run everything on one cluster. This actually came from the session we had with Kelsey Hightower, I believe, or at least I heard it from him, that you always need to have environments. You need to have stages because you need to test these changes on the underlying platform, and you cannot just do everything in production. Considering the time, because we have a hard stop with the recording in a couple of minutes, Christian, I want to do one quick thing with you. If somebody starts learning Kubernetes today or tomorrow, because it's late here, but what are the 5 terms, because every technology comes with new terms, right? What are the 5 terms everybody needs to understand so that they know what this is all about, right? And I start with 1, because this is so that you know what I'm getting at. Mine is kubectl or kubectl. Everybody needs to know that this is the primary tool that you interact with Kubernetes. It's a command line interface to Kubernetes. What else do people need to know about when they hear it the first time?
So I would say the Kubernetes objects at all, like what is an ingress, what is an service, what is a deployment, what is a stateful set, for instance, what are operators. So it's a basic terminology, and also how in a Kubernetes cluster you can traffic is flowing around. So how to reach other services, for instance, over the internal DNS, like here, you know what I mean. Yeah, this is what I would recommend at least that the people are, the people knows about, right? And as you said, kubectl, and also how to monitor their their deployments. So
well, that's
you
easy.
cannot deploy one agent. One agent operator, woo! And I have to say, this was one of the biggest things I was, So when it comes to monitoring, and I saw that Dynatrace released the one agent, I was really happy about it, because before it was kind of how to use Prometheus, what kind of metrics do I need to pull from the API server, whatever. And with one agent, it's perfect.
Can I throw another question? Not a question, but like to this idea, Andy, that you're bringing up there. Now, again, I'm only in theory, right? I'm on this pre-sale side. I'm not dealing with this in real life. But based on conversations we've had with, let's say, Kelsey and some others, right? Would it also be a good idea for anybody moving into Kubernetes to be able to answer why they're using Kubernetes? Like in 1 or 2 paragraphs or less, why are you using Kubernetes? And if they can't answer that, don't start, maybe. I mean, that's a little extreme, but.
And I think this is actually a great point at the end of Christian's presentation, the last point. Think about on how you want to deploy your apps before you start using Kubernetes. So think about this first, so not the reverse, but really before you even get started, answer that question.
Yeah, it's like I said before, you have to think about what workload you want to run on Kubernetes, what you want to achieve, what do you think is the advantage you want to utilize from Kubernetes to run this workload on, right?
All right, Brian, I know we'll have a hard stop. That's why I think we want to kind of conclude here. And Christian, it was a pleasure having you. I know this is not going to be the last. I know we also have a lot of other things planned. We will be speaking at the Red Hat Summit and Red Hat podcast. They've also invited us, so that's going to be great. I know you are, I always keep telling you, start saying no at some point because you have a lot of work to do in your regular life, but I'm still happy that you often say yes to when we ask you. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And it's a pleasure to be on a show where people like Kesley Hightower and so on were guests as well. So.
Yeah.
But do you have a pair of sneakers yet? That's the big question.
And not from the Perform 2021. I have my pair of sneakers from 2020.
So you at least have a pair. Okay. I was just going to say, Andy.
But I'm also wearing, and the podcast listeners will not see it, but
we can take a screenshot.
You've got the nice Dynatrace socks. As an employee, I got the crummier ones. I got the $2 version.
You have it?
Yeah, I got it.
Oh.
Those are awesome. All right. Well, thank you very, very much, Christian. Do you have any social media you want people to follow? LinkedIn, Twitter, anything that you're spouting off all of your brilliant observations, or do you have LinkedIn?
Well, I have a Twitter account with a very professional Twitter handle. It's called @Wurstsalat.
At what a lot?
Wurstsalat, sausage salad in German.
Oh, that's great.
And don't expect any let's say useful content there.
Okay, perfect. All right, really thank you for being on. Andy, was there anything else, or should we go ahead and wrap up?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you so much, Christian. That's really it. I'll see you soon.
If anybody has any questions and comments, you can reach us at pure_DT on Twitter or send us an email at pureperformance@dynatrace.com. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. And Christian, thank you so much for being on. This was very enjoyable. And Andy, as always, thanks for being awesome. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.